I've been driving since I was 26 years old. 19 years. I've logged more miles than I can count, eaten bad food in good company at 3 in the morning, and watched the country slide past my windshield in every kind of light and every kind of dark. I've had breakdowns in the Nevada desert, where the nearest town was 60 miles in either direction. I've run mountain passes in Montana, where the fog was so thick you couldn't see the hood of your own truck. I know this road. I know what it sounds like and smells like, and how it treats you when you don't respect it. I'm not a superstitious man. I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in fatigue, in bad weather, in the way your brain starts doing strange things when you've been staring at asphalt for 11 hours straight. Most strange things on the road have an explanation. Most of them. But I've been doing this long enough to know that most isn't all. And I've talked to enough drivers over enough cups of bad coffee in enough truck stops from here to the Florida state line to understand that some things don't get explained. They just happen. And the people they happen to carry them around like a stone in a pocket. You don't show it to everyone. You only take it out when you're with someone who might understand. So that's what this is. These are stories I've collected over the years. Some of them happened to me. Most of them happened to people I know, people I trust, people who had nothing to gain from making something up. I'm going to tell them to you straight, the way they were told to me. No embellishment, no drama, just what happened. You might want to keep the lights on. I was running a load out of Albuquerque on a Tuesday in late October, headed northeast on I-25 toward Rayton. It was about 2 in the morning, and I'd been moving since noon the day before. Legal on hours, barely, but the kind of tired where your eyes feel dry and your thoughts start to stretch out longer than they should. I had 2 thermoses of coffee and a half a sleeve of crackers and a radio that kept cutting in and out in the mountain stretches. Standard night run. Nothing unusual about any of it. The stretch of I-25 between Santa Fe and Raton is not a road that welcomes you. It climbs through the Sangre de Cristo foothills, and it gets narrow in ways that don't match what the map shows. And at 2 in the morning, there's nobody on it. Not nobody, as in a few cars here and there. Nobody as in, I drove 47 miles that night and counted 3 vehicles total, 2 of which were going the other direction. You get used to that. The isolation doesn't bother me the way it used to. What bothered me was the mile markers. I've driven that stretch probably 30 times over the years. I know the mile markers. I know roughly where I am by feel. Somewhere around mile marker 299, I caught myself looking at a sign I didn't recognize. Not the number, the design. It was the same green reflective sign, same shape, but it had a secondary notation beneath the number. A little white box with black text. I slowed down a little and tried to read it as I passed, and what I saw was a set of coordinates, latitude and longitude, printed right there on a CDOT mile marker sign, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I thought I'd misread it. Tired eyes. Maybe a sticker someone had put there as a joke or a prank. I told myself that, and kept driving. Then there was another one. Mile 301. Same thing. A white box with coordinates, different numbers. I pulled over at the next wide spot, which was a gravel turnout that I'm not sure had a name. I got out and stood in the cold and looked back down the road, and I couldn't see either sign from where I was. I got my phone out and typed in the coordinates I'd remembered from the first sign. I'd written them on my hand while driving, which is not something I'd normally do, but something made me do it. The coordinates pointed to a location about 14 miles due east of where I was standing. Nothing there on the map, no town, no landmark, no road, just a point on a hillside. The second set of coordinates, the ones I'd half remembered from the second sign, I typed in as close as I could. They landed about 6 miles further east of the first point. Also, nothing on any map I could pull up. I stood there for a while. The wind was coming down off the mountains, and it smelled like pine and cold dirt. I got back in the truck, made myself drink some coffee, and kept driving. I didn't see any more signs with coordinates. The rest of the markers were normal. I've driven that stretch 4 times since, and never seen those signs again, and I've looked every single time. I don't know what to do with that. There's no explanation I can reach that accounts for both signs, the same format, different coordinates, both pointing to nothing. So I just carry it. That's what you do. A man named Roy Castellano told me this story at a Flying J outside of Memphis, Tennessee. He was driving for a refrigerated carrier, had been for about 12 years, was the kind of guy who brought his own coffee grounds and a little pour-over setup, because he said Flying J coffee tasted like hot sadness. I liked him immediately. He told me this story in the kind of flat, careful voice a person uses when they want you to understand they're not exaggerating. Roy was running north on Highway 61 out of Vicksburg, Mississippi, loaded with produce, heading for Memphis. It was August, so even at midnight it was still warm enough that his shirt was sticking to his back when he got out of the cab. He was about 30 miles south of Memphis, coming through a stretch of road that runs alongside cotton fields and old farmland, the kind of place that's been farmed for 200 years and carries all the weight of that. He picked up a hitchhiker. I know. He knows. He said he doesn't normally, hasn't since he was in his 20s, but this was a woman standing on the shoulder of the road in the dark in August in Mississippi, with no car anywhere nearby and no lights in any direction, and she looked like she'd been standing there a long time. He pulled over before he'd made a conscious decision to. She was maybe 60, he said. Grey hair pulled back. She was wearing a light-coloured dress that was too formal for the heat, like she'd been somewhere nice and was trying to get home. She didn't say much when she got in. Told him she needed to get to a town called Alligator, which is a real place. It's up near Clarksdale, but it was not on Roy's route, and it was not 30 miles north. It was further west. He told her that, and she nodded, like she already knew, and said that was fine. He could drop her at the next junction. She sat in the passenger seat and looked straight ahead. Roy said he tried to make conversation, but she didn't engage, just answered in short sentences, and after a few minutes he stopped trying and just drove. He had the radio on low. The cab smelled like the strawberries he was hauling. He said he drove maybe 10 minutes with her in the cab, maybe 12. He was watching the road, and at some point he registered that she'd gone quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that has a different weight to it. And he looked over, and she was gone. Not gone like she'd opened the door and jumped out. The door was closed. The seatbelt was hanging loose. He was doing 55 miles an hour on a 2-lane highway in the dark. She was simply not there. He pulled over hard and got out and walked up and down the shoulder with a flashlight for 10 minutes. Nothing. No one. He checked the sleeper cab in the back. Empty. He checked the trailer, which was locked and sealed, and had been since he'd left the loading dock in Vicksburg. Roy called his dispatcher and told him he needed to take a break and didn't explain why. He sat on the shoulder of Highway 61 for 45 minutes before he could make himself get back in the truck. When he got to Memphis and was unloading, the dock foreman made a joke about the strawberries smelling extra good today, and Roy said they smelled fine to him. He'd gotten used to it. The foreman said no, he meant the other smell. He said the cab smelled like perfume. Flowers, he said, like someone had been wearing perfume in there. Roy hadn't mentioned a woman. He hadn't mentioned anything. He just stood there and let the foreman finish what he was saying. There's a rest area on I-80 in eastern Wyoming, somewhere around mile marker 320, that I've stopped at probably a dozen times over the years. It's the kind of rest area that exists because the next town is far enough away that the state felt obligated. 2 low cinder block buildings, a row of parking spaces for trucks, some dying grass, a vending machine that's usually half empty. Nothing remarkable about it. This was maybe 7 years ago. I was coming west out of Cheyenne, running light because I'd delivered in Cheyenne and was deadheading back to Salt Lake to pick up the next load. Deadhead runs are their own particular kind of boring. No weight on the trailer, truck rides different. You've got nothing to do but drive and think. It was around 3 a.m, and I pulled into that rest area to log a quick break and use the bathroom. The lot was empty except for one other truck, a white Kenworth that was running dark, no lights on anywhere, not even the clearance lights. I noted it and didn't think much of it. Sometimes guys run dark when they're sleeping. I parked at the other end of the lot, maybe 200 feet away, and walked to the bathroom. When I came back out, there was a man standing between my truck and the Kenworth, not close to either one, just standing in the space between them, standing still, looking at me. He was wearing a high-vis vest over a dark jacket, the kind road workers wear. No car near him, no equipment. Just standing there in a Wyoming rest area at 3 a.m. in a reflective vest, watching me walk back to my truck. I raised a hand. He didn't move. I got in the truck. I pulled out my logbook and did what I needed to do and looked up after maybe 4 minutes. He was still standing there, same spot, same posture, looking at my cab. I decided I was going to pull out and get back on the road. I started the truck, pulled forward, and my headlights swept through the space where he'd been standing. Nothing there. I drove the lot slow, all the way around. Nobody. I stopped and looked at the Kenworth, still running dark, not a light on it. I knocked on the driver door. No answer. The cab looked empty from outside. I got back on I-80 and drove to the next truck stop, which was a Flying J in Rawlins, about 50 miles further west. I sat there for a while and drank coffee and thought about what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. 2 days later, I was talking to a driver named Preston, who I've known for years, and I mentioned the rest area without mentioning the man. Just mentioned I'd stopped there. Preston got a look on his face and told me he'd stopped there 6 months back, and there'd been a road worker standing in the lot in the middle of the night. Didn't make sense to Preston, because there was no construction anywhere near that rest area. Preston said the guy watched him too. Just watched him. Preston had pulled out and not looked back. We didn't say much after that. Sometimes you don't need to. Maria Ibarra has been driving flatbed for 11 years out of San Antonio, Texas. She hauls construction equipment and oversized loads down into Mexico and back up through the southwest. And she is one of the most composed people I've ever talked to. She has a daughter who wants to be a veterinarian and a husband who teaches middle school history. She told me this story over a plate of eggs at a diner outside of Laredo, and she told it like she was describing a weather event, just something that had happened, just something she'd observed. She was running a load of rebar north on US 83 through the Texas brush country, heading up toward Uvalde. It was late afternoon going into early evening, the sky doing that thing it does in South Texas, where it turns colors you don't see anywhere else. She was about 20 miles south of Uvalde when her left rear airbag on the trailer started giving her a pressure warning. It wasn't critical yet, but it was going to be, and she was watching it. She pulled off at a road she'd never noticed before, just a dirt road going west off US 83 with a wooden cattle gate that was standing open. She didn't go down the road, just pulled off the highway shoulder and got out to check the airbag and her tandems. The bag looked okay visually, but the gauge was still showing low, and she was trying to decide whether to nurse it to Uvalde or call a service truck. While she was under the trailer, she heard a truck. She assumed it was traffic on 83. But then she heard it getting louder, coming from the direction of the dirt road, and she came out from under the trailer and saw a pickup truck coming toward her out of that dirt road. An old one. Late 70s, she thought. The big boxy kind with the chrome bumper. It had no plates she could see. It stopped about 30 feet from her. The man who got out was older, 60s at least. Cowboy hat, work clothes. He walked to her like he knew her, not aggressive, just purposeful. He asked what she had. She told him about the airbag. He nodded and walked past her to the trailer without saying anything else. She watched him. He crouched and looked, and then straightened and said she had a fittings leak, not the bag itself, and that he had what she needed. He went back to his pickup and opened the bed and came back with a fitting, the right size, the right thread, the kind she would have needed to order. He handed it to her. She started to say she needed to pay him, and he shook his head and said to get moving before the light went. Then he walked back to his truck. She made the repair. It took her about 20 minutes. When she stood up, the old pickup was gone. She'd never heard it leave. The dirt road behind that cattle gate was empty, and the gate was now closed. The fitting is still in a Ziploc bag in her truck. She's never installed it, because she made the repair with the one the man gave her, and she doesn't want to use the bag one. She can't tell you why. She said some things you just hold on to. I heard this one from a driver named Danny Pruitt, who runs Refrigerated out of Spokane. He's been doing it for 15 years, and he coaches his daughter's soccer team on weekends, which I know because he mentioned it 3 times, the way a proud dad does. Good guy. The kind of guy you trust to give you straight information, because he doesn't seem to need anything from you. Danny was running south on US 395 in eastern Washington, headed down through the Tri-Cities toward the Oregon border. It was November, around midnight, and the road was glazed with the kind of light frost that you can't see until your headlights catch it just right. He was loaded with frozen product, watching his speed, taking the frost sections carefully, the way you have to, with a loaded reefer unit. Somewhere south of Ritzville, he picked up a CB conversation. 2 drivers, eastbound on I-90, talking about road conditions through Moses Lake. Normal enough. He was half listening while he drove. Then one of the voices said something that made him reach for the CB. The voice said his name, not as part of the conversation. The two drivers were talking about ice conditions, and one of them said, in the middle of a sentence about chain requirements, "Danny's going to want to know about the junction at Kennewick." He keyed up. He asked who was saying his name. The two voices stopped. Silence for a minute, and then one of them came back and said they hadn't said any name. They were talking about road conditions and didn't know any Danny. Danny said he'd heard it plain as anything, and the guy said maybe it was interference from another conversation bleeding through. Said it happened sometimes at night. Danny accepted that. He drove another 30 miles, turning it over in his head and accepting that it was interference, that it was a coincidence, that he'd heard a word that sounded like his name. He got to the junction at Kennewick around 2 in the morning. There was an accident at that junction. Not bad, no injuries, but a fender situation between a sedan and a box truck that had both lanes partially blocked and a state trooper with flares out. Danny had to slow to a crawl to get through. He'd have hit that at full road speed if he hadn't been driving carefully already, which he was because of the frost. But he said it was the kind of situation where if you were coming in hot and not paying attention, you could have had a real problem. He still has the stretch of CB audio. He records his cab with a dash cam that picks up interior audio. He played it back that night in a truck stop parking lot. He could hear the two drivers. He could hear the ice conditions discussion. And then there was a stretch where the audio went strange, compressed and low. And out of that came one word, clear and isolated, not sounding like either of the two voices he'd been listening to. His name. Just once. He doesn't know whose voice it was. There's a man named Gerald Toomey, who I've known since maybe 2009. We've crossed paths at the Scale House on I-40 in Needles, California, more times than I can count. Gerald is 61 years old. He has bad knees and a good attitude about them, and he drove the Southwest Corridor for over 2 decades before he went into dispatch. He told me this story maybe 4 years before he retired from driving, and he told it like a man reports an inspection violation, just the facts laid out in order, with no particular emotion attached to them. Gerald was running I-40 westbound through the Mojave, loaded with auto parts, heading for the distribution hub in Ontario, California. It was July, which means it was hot enough in the Mojave, even at 2 in the morning, that you could feel the heat through the door panel. He'd been running all day, and he was legal on hours, but not by much, and he was planning to stop in Needles and log his rest break. About 40 miles east of Needles, somewhere in the stretch where the road goes through the hills and you lose cell signal completely, his truck began to pull left. Not aggressively, not a blowout, just a consistent left pull, like he was losing tire pressure on the steer axle, left side. He slowed down and started looking for somewhere to pull over safely, which out there means finding a spot wide enough that you're not half in the lane. He found a wide gravel shoulder and stopped, got out with his flashlight and walked the steer axle. Tire looked fine. Not flat, not low, no visible damage. He walked the drives. Everything looked okay. He got back in and pulled out slowly, and the pull was gone. Whatever it had been, it had corrected itself, which in Gerald's experience doesn't happen. Pull left means something. It doesn't just go away. He got to Needles, pulled into the scale house to get weighed, and the DOT officer who came out looked at his steer tires and asked him when he'd had them rotated last. Gerald said a few months back. The officer pointed to the left steer and told him that tyre had a valve stem issue, that the cap was cross-threaded and the stem was damaged. He said the tyre was losing air, probably slowly. He said Gerald had been lucky it hadn't gone further, and he put Gerald out of service until he could get the tyre swapped. Gerald sat in the scale house lot while he waited for a tyre service truck. He thought about the pull he'd felt 40 miles back. He thought about how he'd walked the steer axle with a flashlight and hadn't seen anything wrong with that tyre. He thought about how the pull had disappeared after he stopped. He said he thought about it for a long time. He said the thing that bothered him most was not the pull. It was that when he'd gotten out to check the tyre with his flashlight, checking a tyre he'd driven on for months, he hadn't noticed the valve stem. But when the DOT officer came out, in the dark, with a small flashlight, in about 10 seconds, he pointed right at it. Gerald said it was like someone had wanted him to stop. He said he was aware of how that sounded. He said it too. Let me tell you about something that happened to a woman named Connie Marsh. Connie drove team with her husband for years, and then he retired due to a back issue, and she went solo, which she said she actually preferred because she could control the music. She's been solo for 6 years. She hauls dry goods, mostly, out of a carrier based in Atlanta, and she knows the southeast interstates like the lines on her own hands. She was running I-16 east toward Savannah, Georgia, empty, which means she was dead-heading back to the hub after a delivery in Macon. It was midweek in February, late at night. I-16 between Macon and Savannah is not a road that gives you much to look at. Long, flat stretches, pine trees on both sides, occasional overpass. She had the radio on and was making good time. Around the Dublin area, she saw a man walking on the shoulder. Eastbound, same direction she was going. Walking with purpose, not stumbling, not waving for help. Just walking along the shoulder of an interstate at 2 in the morning in February, in Georgia, in a light jacket. She slowed and went past him and looked in her mirror. He was still walking, not looking at her truck. She decided not to stop. She told herself she was not going to stop, that there was nothing good that came from picking up walkers on I-16 at 2 in the morning, and she drove another 5 miles before something she couldn't name made her pull over. She sat there with her hazards on for maybe 3 minutes. In her mirror, she could see back down the road. She could see her own tail lights painting the lane red. She waited for him to come up on her. He'd been walking at a good pace, not far back when she'd passed him. He should have reached her truck in 3 minutes. He didn't come. She waited another 2 minutes. Then she pulled out slowly and did the one thing you're not supposed to do on an interstate, which was back up slowly along the shoulder, her hazard still going, watching her mirrors. She backed up maybe half a mile. Nobody there. No one on the shoulder. No one in the ditch. No break in the tree line where someone could have gone through quickly. She pulled forward and got back up to speed. She felt unsettled in a way she couldn't shake, and an hour later, when she pulled into the terminal in Savannah and was talking to the night dock guy, she mentioned it, just offhand, just the fact of a man walking on I-16, and the dock guy looked at her with an expression she described as careful, like he was deciding something. He told her there was a story about that stretch of I-16, that there had been a man, years ago, who'd broken down and tried to walk to Dublin and hadn't made it. He told her the story like he'd told it before. He didn't confirm that it was real, Didn't say it was definitely a ghost, just told her the story and went back to checking her paperwork. Connie said she didn't look into it. She said she thought about looking it up and then decided she didn't want to know. She still runs I-16. She still passes that stretch near Dublin. She keeps both hands on the wheel through there and doesn't look in the mirror. I want to tell you about a stop on US 2 in Montana. If you've never run US 2 through the northern part of the state, it's the kind of road that makes you understand why early settlers sometimes lost their minds out here. It's flat, and it goes forever, and the sky is too big for the land, and in the winter it gets so cold that your fuel gels if you're not running the right additive. I've run it in January, when the outside temp read -23, and the heater was working hard just to keep the windshield clear. A driver named Sam Kowalczyk, who I've known for years through the Northern Plains circuit, told me this happened to him in March, which is still winter up there. He was running empty after a delivery in Havre, heading west towards Shelby to pick up a load of grain for a co-op out of Great Falls. Empty truck, cold night, nothing but dark and the rumble strip to keep him company. He stopped at a little combination gas station and bar in a town I won't name, because I couldn't verify the name of the place afterward. And that's part of why I'm telling the story. The town is real. He can tell you roughly where it is on US 2, within a 20-mile stretch. But when he and I both looked at maps afterward, we couldn't find a gas station or a bar at any of those exits. We found the town name, an unincorporated community with maybe 200 residents, but the combination gas and bar wasn't on Google, wasn't on any trucking directory Sam uses, and when he called the county later and described the building, the woman he spoke to said she wasn't aware of any business matching that description currently operating. He'd gotten fuel there. He'd paid cash, which he does. He'd gone inside and had a cup of coffee and talked briefly with the man behind the counter, who Sam described as someone who fit perfectly in that kind of place. Older, flannel shirt, quiet, not unfriendly, but not looking for conversation. He said the coffee was good, and the place was warm, and there was a cat sleeping on the counter next to the register. He drove west after that, and made his pickup in Shelby, and delivered in Great Falls, and didn't think much about the stop until he went to do his expense log and couldn't account for the fuel purchase. He'd filled there. He remembered the gallons and the price, but there was no receipt because he'd paid cash and hadn't thought to ask for one, and the mileage on his fuel log didn't match. He had the fuel he'd bought, the tank level was right, but the mileage he'd logged and the mileage on the odometer were 11 miles apart. He'd somehow driven 11 miles that weren't on his log. He went back 3 weeks later on the same route, drove slow through that stretch of US 2, found the town, found the road where the building should have been. There was a foundation there, concrete and some old framing, overgrown, the kind of thing that had been sitting empty for years. He parked and got out and walked around it. It smelled like cold concrete and old wood and nothing else. Sam is not a fanciful man. He does his logs carefully. He follows his routes carefully, and he knows Montana roads. He said the only conclusion he could reach was that the 11 miles had happened somewhere he couldn't account for, and that he'd gotten coffee from somewhere that didn't exist anymore, and that the cat had been orange. And he remembered that specifically because he'd thought at the time, what a good life to be a cat in a warm building in Montana in March. A driver named Pete Okafor runs the I-10 corridor between Houston and Jacksonville. He's been doing it for 8 years, and before that, he was in logistics management. So he's methodical in a way that most drivers aren't. The kind of guy who keeps a handwritten mileage log in addition to his ELD because he doesn't fully trust the electronics. He told me this story at a pilot truck stop outside of Pensacola, Florida, and he prefaced it by saying he'd considered not telling anyone, but that he'd decided the only way to make sense of it was to say it out loud. He was running I-10 eastbound through Mississippi, somewhere in the stretch between Hattiesburg and Biloxi, loaded with household goods for a moving company, doing around 63 in the right lane. It was around 4 in the morning. He'd been driving since noon the previous day, and he was at the end of his legal hours, planning to stop in Biloxi. He saw a car on the shoulder with its hazards on, a sedan, he thought a blue one, older model. He noted it and went past. About a mile further up, the same car was on the shoulder. Hazards on, sedan, blue, older. He thought he'd miscounted or misjudged the distance, and that it was just the one car, and he'd caught up to it. He went past again. 3 miles further, same car, same shoulder, driver's side, hazards going. He slowed down and got on the CB and asked if anyone had eyes on a blue sedan with hazards running on the eastbound shoulder through that stretch of I-10. Nobody responded at first. Then a driver named, he thought, Sully, came on and said he was about 5 miles back eastbound and he wasn't seeing any car. Then a westbound driver said he'd just come through that stretch going the other direction and he hadn't seen anything on the shoulder either. Pete pulled over. The car was not there. He was looking at empty shoulder. He sat there for a minute, hazards on his own rig, and then pulled back onto the interstate. He doesn't tell this story to explain what the car was. He tells it because of what happened about 12 miles further east. There was a man on the shoulder, a real man, standing and waving his arms, and behind him was a car that had gone halfway into the shallow drainage ditch at the side of the road and was canted at an angle with its front wheel down in the water. The hazards were not on that car. The man was not in distress exactly, but he was stuck, and it was 4 in the morning on I-10, and nobody was stopping. Pete stopped. He had tow straps. It took 45 minutes, but he got the car out. The man was an older guy, driving alone, had gone off the shoulder in the dark because something had run across the road. He hadn't been hurt, and his car drove okay once they got it out. Pete got back in his truck and sat there for a minute before pulling out. He thought about the 3 sightings of the blue car. The car in the ditch hadn't been blue. It had been silver. He's thought about that a lot since. Whether the blue car had been trying to slow him down, trying to get him to stop early enough to matter, or whether it had been trying to get him to do something else entirely, and he just happened to stop at the right moment. He said he's genuinely not sure. He said that part of not knowing is what he carries with him. The last story I'm going to tell you tonight, I'll keep shorter, because it doesn't need much. It happened to me, and I've told it maybe 3 times in my life, and each time it comes out the same way, because there isn't much to add or take away from it. I was running I-70 westbound through Kansas, a route I've run so many times, it's practically involuntary. It was spring, early May, and there was a line of thunderstorms moving northeast that had been pacing me for about an hour, close enough that I could see the lightning in my driver's side mirror, but far enough that I wasn't catching any rain. The sky ahead of me was clear, and the sky behind me was active, and that's a particular kind of strange that you don't forget. I was somewhere around the Salina area, which is about 90 miles west of Topeka, when I saw a truck parked on the shoulder about a quarter mile ahead of me. As I got closer, I could see it was a semi, an older-looking conventional cab, and it was dark, no lights running. Not unusual, except for the time, which was around 2 in the morning, and the fact that it was pulled under the shoulder at an odd angle, not parallel to the road, but slightly diagonal, like it had coasted to a stop rather than been parked. I pulled up behind it slowly, about 100 feet back, and sat there. I turned on my hazards. I waited to see if anyone was moving. No movement. I keyed up the CB and put out that I was sitting behind a dark conventional on the shoulder of I-70 westbound near mile marker 253, and did anyone have information? Nobody responded. I sat there for another 3 minutes, thinking about whether to get out. I've helped guys on the shoulder before. It's the thing you do. But something about the angle of that truck and the complete absence of any light made me hesitant, and I'm not someone who hesitates easily. I finally decided to pull up alongside it slowly. I came up, watching the cab, and when my headlights swept across the driver's window, I saw something that took me a moment to process. There was a man in the driver's seat. He was sitting upright, hands on the wheel, looking straight ahead, just sitting there in a dark truck on the shoulder of I-70 at 2 in the morning, engine off, no lights, hands on the wheel, looking straight ahead down the road. I stopped. I was even with his cab. My passenger window was about 6 feet from his driver's window. I looked at him. He didn't look at me. Didn't turn his head. Didn't acknowledge my headlights washing across him. He just looked forward. I watched him for probably 30 seconds, which is a long time when you're sitting still on an interstate shoulder at night. Then I looked back at the road, checked my mirrors, and pulled out. I got back up to speed and drove. I never called it in. I've thought about that since. I should have called it in. I told myself he was fine, that he was sleeping sitting up, which some guys do, that he'd been spooked by the storms and was waiting them out. I told myself all of that, but his hands were on the wheel, both of them, at 10 and 2, the way you hold it when you're driving, and his eyes were open. I'm sure of that. Open and forward, in a truck that wasn't moving, on a dark shoulder in Kansas, while lightning moved in the distance. I don't know who he was, or what he was doing. I don't know what I interrupted, or what I happened to see. I know I checked my mirrors for the next 20 miles, and he never pulled out behind me. The shoulder stayed empty the whole way to the horizon. So that's what I've got tonight. 10 stories, 10 different roads, 10 different people, 10 different things that didn't resolve the way things are supposed to resolve. I'm not going to tell you what to make of them. That's not my job. My job is to drive and to pay attention, and that's all I've ever done. The road at night is not the same road as in the daytime. I don't mean that in some mysterious way. I mean it practically. There are fewer people on it, and that means the strange things that happen get more airtime in your head. There's less noise to fill the space. You notice things, and the things you notice stay with you differently than they do in daylight, when there's traffic and coffee shop conversation and your phone buzzing to pull your attention somewhere else. At night, there's just you and the road and the sound of the engine and whatever's out there in the dark at the edge of what your headlights can reach. And some of what's out there I can explain. Some of it I've explained to myself over the years, filed it away, moved on. Fatigue, weather, the way the brain fills in gaps when it's running low on sleep and high on hours. I believe in all of that. I've seen what tired does to a person, and I have no interest in pretending every strange thing is something more than it is. But some of it I can't explain, and I've made my peace with that. You drive long enough, you stop needing everything to have a name. You just note it, the way you note a change in weather or a pull in the steering. Something's there. You don't know what it is. You keep driving. That's all any of us can do. Pay attention out there. Keep your eyes on the road and your hands on the wheel. And if something doesn't feel right, slow down. It costs you nothing to slow down. I'll see you on the next one.